to a single people. Vanquished, Turnus and the Rutuli turned north to the rich and powerful Etruscans for help. The Etruscans were more than willing to lend a hand against the growing menace of the Trojan-infused Latins and attacked. But Aeneas, in his final act, led the Latins to victory, establishing the Tiber River as the boundary between the Latins and the Etruscans. We should pause the legend here before we get too far and give an account of the political landscape of pre-Roman Italy as historians and archaeologists understand it today. Who were the Latins? Who were the Etruscans? Where did they come from and what sort of lives did they lead? The origin of the Etruscans is debatable. However, DNA evidence points to a migration from Asia Minor, which, if true, offers a context for the legend of Aeneas' arrival from Troy. The Etruscans were the dominant force culturally and politically in the Italian peninsula, and, as we will see, came to dominate Latin territory in the waning years of the Roman kingdom. They had developed cities and a confederal state system long before the Latins, who remained in traditional tribal affiliations until the foundation of Rome, which was the first major settlement in Latin territory that could be called a city. The Etruscans were artists and craftsmen who had set up extensive trading networks that reached all the way to Greece. The trading roads between Etruria and the Greek cities of Magna Graecia in the south ran right through Rome, offering a clue as to the reason for its location. The Latins, in contrast, were simple pastoral herdsmen. Evidence from ancient burial mounds suggests the Latins were descended from Balkan migrants who crossed, mostly shepherds and farmers. They did not have any sort of advanced arts or crafts. What culture they display seems to be little more than a blend of Etruscan and Greek elements. Indeed, nothing about later Roman history suggests the Latins were innovative at all in art, religion, or letters. They excelled at warfare and engineering and administrating, but were merely students of philosophy, never instructors. Their gods, to take one obvious example, are little more than an adaptation of the Greek pantheon, Zeus becoming Jupiter, Hera becoming Juno, and so forth. What bound the Latins together was a common language, distinct from the Etruscan language to the north and the imported Greek in the south. Latin, of course, forms the basis for half the languages in Europe, and its vocabulary still dominates the legal profession. But enough humorless anthropology. After Aeneas died, his young son Ascanius grew to be king. The town built by the Trojan settlers had become too small for the exploding population, and Ascanius led a group east to found a new settlement called Alba Longa, which would become the seat of the growing Latin kingdom. Generation upon generation followed, and the Latins became powerful and secure. The kingship was passed from father to son until finally it rested upon the head of a man named Numitor. Numitor had a brother named Amulius who coveted the throne and decided to seize power for himself. Numitor was driven from Alba Longa, all his sons were killed, and his daughter, Rea Silvia, was forced to become a Vestal virgin to ensure she would bear no children who could threaten Amulius. However, after taking the vows, Rea was the victim of rape and consequently gave birth to twin boys. Rea declared that the god Mars was the father, but to no avail, and, for the crime of allowing herself to be raped, she was thrown in prison. The twins were sent to be drowned in the Tiber. However, the men entrusted with the task found the river flooded and left the boys in the sluggish water rather than slogging their way to the river itself, and when the waters receded, the babies were left alive and well in the reeds. Here, legend states that a she-wolf, coming to the river to quench her thirst, found the babies and offered her teats for them to suckle on. A herdsman came upon the scene and gathered the children up from the wolf who had been gently licking them and took them home with him. Even Livy acknowledges that the story of the wolf is a fable and postulates that it may have arisen because the herdsman's wife was a whore named Wolf. The herdsman and his wife raised the boys, named Romulus and Remus, as their own, and soon they grew to be men. Apparently the boys took a liking to fighting the local brigands who raided the countryside and began taking the fight to the robbers, raiding their camps and stealing from them. The criminals, angered by the theft of their booty, set a trap for the twins. Romulus managed to escape, but Remus was captured. The brigands took Remus to the local landowner, who turned out to be none other than the exiled Numitor, and claimed Remus and his brother had been caught stealing Numitor's cattle and that he should be punished. Numitor was immediately reminded of his twin grandsons and, realizing that they would be the same age as Remus was now, began to suspect that the boys were his blood. Numitor began making inquiries, and soon learned the particulars of their upbringing and became convinced that they were his daughter's children. The herdsman, knowing Remus was in Numitor's custody, and having himself long suspected that his two boys were of royal blood, decided to tell Romulus the whole story of their discovery by the river. From this, a plan was hatched to return Numitor to the throne. With Romulus leading one group of men and Remus another, they surprised and killed Amulius and brought Numitor back to Alba Longa. Numitor told the story of his brother's treachery and the circumstances of his grandson's birth, and the people shouted unanimous consent that Numitor be king once again. After Numitor became king, Romulus and Remus decided to found a new settlement at the spot where they had been left to drown. There are two accounts of what happened next. One states that trouble arose when the question of who would be senior in the new city was raised. They decided to allow the gods to decide, and each retired to the top of a hill, Romulus the Palatine and Remus the Aventine, to await a sign. Soon enough, 6 vultures landed at the feet of Remus, and when his followers made this known to Romulus, 12 vultures immediately landed at Romulus's feet. A fight broke out, with one side claiming primacy of arrival, and the other claiming primacy of number. In this fight, Remus was killed. The other, more famous story is that Remus, mocking his brother, jumped over the partially completed walls, and Romulus, in a fit of anger, killed him, swearing, "So perish whoever shall overleap my battlements." Either way, Romulus obtained sole power, the city was named for him, and he became its first king. The legendary date of foundation is April the 21st, 753 BC. Did it happen like this? Almost certainly not. After the sack of Rome in 386 BC, most of the early historical record was lost, and with it the specifics we need for an accurate telling of the story. But archaeological evidence seems to support the broader strokes of the legend. Settlements have been found on the Palatine Hill that date from the 800s BC, suggesting that the legendary chronology is at least in the ballpark. The general story of a struggle between the Latin and Etruscan people, ending with ostensible Latin autonomy south of the Tiber, also fits our understanding of the ethnic and cultural landscape of the era. It is doubtful that the site of Rome was chosen because it marked where the twins had been sent to die. More likely an easy river crossing, coupled with the natural defenses offered by the nearby hills, drew settlers to the area. And of course, as already noted, the site lay on the trade road between Etruria and Magna Graecia. Without any real data to draw from, later Roman historians used common mythological elements to construct a conventional founding legend. Indo-European culture produced numerous examples of the divine twin mytheme, including Castor and Pollux, and Idas and Lynceus of Thebes. The motif of infant exposure gone wrong crops up in the biographies of both Perseus and Moses. And of course, most will recognize the virgin birth element from Christianity, but tales of miraculous or virgin births have surrounded important legendary and historical figures for millennium. The addition of Aeneas gives Rome a lofty ancestor and connects their city to the Greek civilizations the Romans so admired. However it happened, a settlement was established at the bend in the Tiber. This settlement grew and came to dominate its neighboring communities, then the entire Italian peninsula, then the entire Mediterranean. Next, we will cover Rome's unsavory beginnings. They stole to ensure that there would be a second generation of Romans, and whether Romulus, great soldier that he was, died or simply faded away. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Last time, we discussed the events that led up to the birth of Rome, covering the arrival of Aeneas into Italy and the story of the twins, Romulus and Remus. Today we will cover the remainder of Romulus's life, his questionable morality, and his ultimate disappearance from the world of men. After Romulus founded the city, it became apparent that he would need to attract settlers in order to ensure its survival. To this end, he opened up the city to what could tactfully be described as colorful characters, but, put simply, they were the dregs of society. Fugitives, escaped slaves, debtors, and criminals all flocked to the new town to start fresh, and Romulus welcomed them with open arms. The first order of business in true Roman fashion was to establish an army. Romulus sifted through his new subjects and divided them into able-bodied men of military age and, well, everyone else. Most sources agree that the first legions consisted of 3,000 foot soldiers and 300 cavalry, but accounts differ as to whether there was initially just one legion or whether there were many. Soldiers in those days had to equip themselves, so only well-to-do citizens could enlist, with the richest citizens serving in the cavalry because they were the only ones who could afford horses. This meant that the interests of the army were, in those early days, firmly squared with the interests of the society it defended, at least the middle and upper classes of that society. In later years, the legions were filled with mercenary soldiers, whose interests often diverged from those of the actual citizens of Rome, who had long since given up fighting for themselves. Here the seeds would be sown for civil war, decline, and ultimately destruction. But for now, Rome's army fought for the people, not against them. From the remaining motley assembly of those not called to arms, Romulus created a council of 100 senators to help him govern, either because that number was enough for his purposes, or because there were only 100 men respectable enough to be given such responsibility. The descendants of these men would become the patrician class of later Rome, who would find themselves constantly at odds with the plebeian class, the descendants of the remaining unwashed masses. Rome was now ready to defend and govern itself, but there was just one problem. The new arrivals were almost entirely male. Without any women around, the dream of Rome would die after a single generation. So delegations were sent around to the neighboring communities to ask for intermarriage rights, but wherever they went they were refused. Fathers did not want their daughters married to the Romans, who, after all, were nothing more than a collection of despicable cast-offs. The Romans resented these rejections, and so Romulus thought up a surefire way to acquire wives for his people. They would steal them. The Romans invited all the neighboring communities to a great festival honoring Neptune. They spared no expense in preparing and promoting the celebration, and on the appointed day, a great crowd filled Rome, including, famously, the Sabines. All was going well and no one suspected a thing, until Romulus suddenly gave a signal, and the men of Rome seized all the visiting women they could capture. The festival was broken up and the parents of the seized women fled the city, cursing the treachery of the Romans. The seized women were naturally horrified at their predicament, but Romulus went to them and claimed that it was their parents who were to blame, because they had been too proud to wed their daughters to Roman men. Further, he said, they would all be treated better in Rome than anywhere else, because the Roman men would feel obligated to work off the guilt over what they had done. Apparently this mollified the women, but it did nothing for their parents and brothers. Attacks followed in succession from the victimized communities, but each was repelled by Romulus and the Roman forces. Finally, only the Sabines had not yet sought revenge. They waited and planned rather than immediately taking up arms. When the time was right, the Sabines bribed a young girl to let them into the citadel of the city, and took it before the Romans could react. Romulus immediately mustered his army and launched a counterattack. A brief battle was joined, but neither side could gain the upper hand. Finally, the Sabine women, daughters of one side and husbands of the other, intervened, throwing themselves between the two, pleading with them to halt. Livy writes, "We are mothers now," they cried. "Our children are your sons, your grandsons. Do not put on them the stain of parricide. If our marriage, if the relationship between you, is hateful to you, turn your hatred against us. We are the cause of strife. On our account our husbands and fathers lie wounded or dead, and we would rather die ourselves than live either widowed or orphaned." Their entreaties moved the opposing armies and peace was made, ultimately joining the Romans and